Hi, I'm Dr. Mo, and for this week, our lecture will cover the concept of trophic cascades. To understand trophic cascades, let's use the ecosystem of a freshwater lake. At the base of the food web in a freshwater lake, there are phytoplankton, and the total production of phytoplankton in a lake is dependent upon many things that are related to species that are present in the water community, but it is primarily limited by two major controls: nutrients and grazing. Provided that enough light and space are present in the water, most phytoplankton will grow well if there are sufficient nutrients. These are mainly phosphorus and nitrogen. But sometimes they also include things like silica and carbon. Carbon is a nutrient that's required for growth, but carbon is typically abundant in all terrestrial ecosystems, and so it is rarely a limiting nutrient. The other control on phytoplankton growth is typically grazing pressures from zooplankton. The zooplankton feed upon the phytoplankton. In ecological terms, these two controlling forces are often referred to as bottom-up pressure. In other words, from the bottom of the food pyramid, nutrients can limit growth, and top-down pressure, because these grazing pressures come from the top of the food web down. In the simplest terms, we can number the trophic levels, with nutrients being 0, phytoplankton being 1, and zooplankton being 2. In this case, trophic level 1 are producers that depend on and consume trophic level 0, the nutrients, and trophic level 2, the primary consumers, are herbivores that depend on and consume trophic level 1. So if nutrients are abundant, the phytoplankton can be abundant. But if zooplankton are present, they would probably be consumed, and so there wouldn't be very much phytoplankton present in these systems. In this sort of lake ecosystem, if we looked into the water at any given time, it might look like there were simply a large abundance of zooplankton in the water, and it would otherwise be fairly clear. However, what happens if we add another trophic level? In this case, we can add fish that mostly eat zooplankton. In our numbering system, this would be trophic level 3. They are secondary consumers, or what we call planktivores. If we added these fish to the ecosystem, they would necessarily consume the zooplankton from trophic level 2, reducing their number, and this would relieve the grazing pressure on the phytoplankton. So if we were monitoring this ecosystem after we added the planktivorous fish at level 3, we would expect the water to become enriched with phytoplankton. So if we were to collect a sample from the lake, it would probably be a lot of planktivorous fish, a few zooplankton, and lots of algae, because the grazing pressure is now being exerted on trophic level 2 and being relieved from trophic level 1. Now what happens if we add another trophic level? In this case, we can add fish that eat the planktivorous fish as trophic level 4. These would be tertiary consumers, or piscivores. In this case, the grazing pressure is now exerted on trophic level 3, it is relieved on trophic level 2, and is re-exerted on trophic level 1. So a sample from this water would show piscivorous fish, few planktivorous fish, lots of zooplankton, and very few phytoplankton. This is what is referred to as a trophic cascade. In other words, when trophic levels that are odd-numbered levels are abundant, it reduces the abundance of the trophic levels that are evenly numbered. Of course, the total biomass for each trophic level would decrease as you go up, because in a typical trophic pyramid, about 90% of the energy is lost from each level. So zooplankton that consume phytoplankton tend to have about 10% of the total biomass of the phytoplankton, and planktivorous fish about 10% of the biomass of the zooplankton, and in this case, piscivorous fish would have about 10% of the biomass of the planktivorous fish. So if the original biomass of the algae in the lake was about 100,000 grams of algae, it would support about 10,000 grams of zooplankton, which could support about 1,000 grams of planktivorous fish and a lowly 100 grams of piscivorous fish. In other words, it doesn't take a lot of organisms at the top of the food pyramid to substantially alter the entire food web. There are two examples from the Pacific Ocean where trophic cascades have been directly tied to ecosystem health. Seagrasses and kelp forests are important habitat for a wide range of ocean organisms, and their health is usually directly linked to the overall health of the ecosystems where they occur. In the Aleutian Island, in places in the Pacific Ocean where there are no top predators to control the sea urchins, the kelp forests have been decimated. However, in parts of the ocean where sea otters are present, they feast upon the largest of these sea urchins, and this has allowed for the recovery of some of the kelp forests. Here we see a simple trophic cascade in action. The otters graze down the populations of the sea urchins, which allows the kelp forest to rebound. Farther south, near Monterey Bay, California, the sea otters are part of a more elaborate, but no less important trophic cascade. When otters are absent, the eelgrass is covered by a thick layer of algae, which typically leads to the destruction of this habitat as it impedes the growth of the eelgrasses. This is because algae growing upon the grass is normally grazed by sea slugs. But in this estuary, the sea slugs are heavily grazed upon by crabs. The presence of otters in these ecosystems leads to a reduction in the population of crabs, which in turn leads to more sea slugs, and this produces more grazing on the algae, and ultimately this results in healthy eelgrass habitats. As before, even and odd trophic levels alternate in their abundance in the ecosystem, and the competing forces of bottom and top-down pressures leads to a complex trophic cascade. In both of these cases, sea otters play a key role in keeping the ecosystem balanced and healthy, and it clarifies the indirect ways that small changes at the top of the trophic pyramid can have a dramatic influence on the entire ecosystem. This is how trophic cascades work.